Hello there, seeker of silence. Come a little closer, if you will. The night outside has settled into that familiar Gotham rhythm, where the rain traces its slow patterns across rooftops and alleyways, and the city breathes in a way only it understands. If these quiet stories bring you peace, feel free to subscribe, so that whenever another tale unfolds beneath dim lights and distant thunder, you may find your way back again. Now then, let us begin. The docks of Gotham had always been a place of half-forgotten things. Crates arrived without records, ships departed without witnesses, and names were spoken only once before they vanished into the tide. Tonight, the rain gave the harbor a dim sheen, reflecting the distant glow of the city skyline like a fractured mirror. Detective Elias Vaughn stood at the edge of Pier 19, collar turned up against the drizzle, a worn notebook tucked beneath his arm. He had been called here just after dusk, though no official report had been filed. That in itself was not unusual. What was unusual was the pattern. 3 disappearances in as many weeks. No bodies, no signs of struggle, only small details left behind, like fragments of a story no one had bothered to finish. A lantern flickered near the warehouse entrance behind him, casting long shapes across the damp wooden planks. Somewhere out in the harbor, a buoy bell rang at uneven intervals, carried by the shifting water. Elias glanced down at the most recent note. Dock worker. Name: Harris Cole. Last seen near Warehouse B. He closed the notebook with a quiet snap. Warehouse B, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The building stood a short distance away, its rusted doors partially open, as though someone had stepped inside and simply forgotten to close them again. A faint line of light slipped through the gap, thin and uncertain. Elias approached at an unhurried pace, boots tapping softly against the boards. Each step seemed to echo a little longer than it should have, as if the dock itself were listening. He paused just outside the doorway. Inside, the air carried the scent of salt, old rope, and something else. Something faintly metallic, though not strong enough to suggest blood. Just a trace, like a memory. He pushed the door open a little further. The hinges groaned, low and reluctant. Rows of stacked crates stretched into the shadows, some marked with faded shipping symbols, others completely unlabeled. A single overhead lamp swayed gently, its light drifting back and forth, never quite settling in one place. Elias stepped inside. Water dripped steadily from his coat onto the wooden floor, forming a slow, irregular rhythm that filled the empty space. "Anyone here?" he called, his voice calm, measured. There was no answer. Only the distant creak of wood and the rain against the roof. He moved deeper into the warehouse, passing between the crates, his fingers brushing lightly against their surfaces as he went. The wood was damp, swollen from years of exposure. Some of the markings had been scratched away as though deliberately removed. Halfway down the central aisle, he stopped. Something lay on the ground ahead. A hat. Simple. Dark. The kind a dock worker might wear to keep the rain from his eyes. It had fallen on its side, one edge slightly crushed as though stepped on or dropped in haste. Elias crouched beside it, lifting it carefully, still dry on the inside, which meant it hadn't been there long. His gaze shifted to the floor around it. No signs of a struggle, no scuff marks, no overturned crates. Just the faint outline of footprints, barely visible, leading further into the warehouse. And then, abruptly, stopping, as if whoever had walked there had simply ceased to exist. Elias straightened slowly, the hat still in his hand. "Well," he said under his breath, "that's new." The overhead lamp flickered once, briefly dimming the room before returning to its usual unsteady glow. For a moment, the shadows seemed to shift. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be easily named, just enough to make the space feel deeper. Elias placed the hat on a nearby crate. Then he followed the footprints. They led him toward the back wall, where a series of old shipping containers had been stacked haphazardly over the years. Rust had eaten through their edges, leaving jagged lines and hollowed corners. He ran his hand along one of them, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingertips, and then he noticed it. A narrow gap between two containers, too small to be a proper passage, but just wide enough for someone to slip through sideways. Elias leaned closer, peering into the darkness beyond. There was no light inside, no sound, just a space where the warehouse seemed to give way to something else, something hidden behind its outer shell. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow corridor between the containers, the floor littered with scattered debris, broken glass, old nails, pieces of rope, and footprints, clearer this time, leading inward. Elias hesitated for only a moment. Then he stepped into the gap. The air inside felt cooler, stiller, as though the rain itself had been left behind at the entrance. The sounds of the harbor faded, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to come from somewhere deeper within. He moved carefully, the flashlight steady in his hand. The corridor twisted slightly, narrowing in places, widening in others, until it finally opened into a small, enclosed space at the back of the warehouse. Elias lowered the light. And there, in the center of the room, he found the second clue. Not a body, not a weapon, but something far stranger. A small wooden crate, no larger than a suitcase, its lid partially open. And inside, neatly arranged as though placed with care, a collection of watches, dozens of them, all ticking, all set to different times. Elias stood very still, listening. Tick, tick, tick. Each one marking its own quiet passage, out of sync with the others, creating a layered rhythm that filled the room in a way that felt deliberate. He exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, almost thoughtfully. "Now we're getting somewhere." The rain continued its steady fall outside, unnoticed for the moment as the mystery of the docks began to unfold. Elias remained where he stood for a moment, the beam of his flashlight resting over the open crate. The watches continued their uneven chorus, each one marking time in its own quiet insistence. Some ticked fast, others slow, and a few seemed almost hesitant, as though unsure whether to continue at all. He crouched beside the crate, resting one hand lightly on its edge. Up close, the details became clearer. These were not all the same kind of watch. Some were simple pocket watches, their silver surfaces dulled by age. Others were wristwatches, leather straps worn thin, metal faces scratched and clouded. A few looked newer, though even they carried small signs of use. None of them were broken, and yet none of them showed the same time. Elias picked one up, turning it carefully between his fingers. The ticking felt steady, almost reassuring, but when he lifted his gaze, the room around him seemed to shift in a way that was difficult to place. Not a movement, not exactly, more like a subtle change in how the space held itself. He slipped the watch into his coat pocket. Then slowly he rose to his feet. The footprints that had led him here circled the crate once, twice, and then stopped. Just as they had earlier, they ended without continuation, as if the person who made them had simply stepped out of the world mid-stride. Elias swept the flashlight across the walls. Nothing. No hidden doors. No loose panels. Just rusted metal and old wood, worn down by years of neglect. He stepped back toward the narrow corridor, pausing once more at the crate. "Someone wanted this found," he murmured. It wasn't a question. The arrangement, the care, even the placement deep within the warehouse suggested intention. This was not something left behind in haste. This was something presented. Elias turned and made his way back through the passage. The hum faded as he approached the main warehouse floor, replaced once again by the distant rhythm of rain and the occasional creak of wood. When he stepped out from between the containers, the overhead lamp flickered as if acknowledging his return. He glanced at the hat still resting on the crate where he had left it. For a moment he considered taking it. Instead, he left it where it was. Outside, the rain had deepened, falling in steadier lines that blurred the edges of the docks. The city lights beyond the harbor shimmered faintly, their reflections broken by the restless surface of the water. Elias stepped onto the pier, pulling his coat tighter around him. A figure stood near the far end, barely visible through the rain, still watching. Elias did not reach for anything. He simply adjusted his stance and began walking toward the figure at an even pace, his boots echoing softly against the wood. The figure did not move. As the distance between them closed, details began to emerge. A long coat, dark and heavy, a hat pulled low, shadowing the face, hands tucked into pockets, shoulders relaxed. Not a dock worker, not a patrol officer, something else. Elias stopped a few steps away. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then at last the figure tilted their head slightly. "You found it," the voice said. Low, measured, almost expectant. Elias regarded the figure carefully. "Depends what you mean by it." A faint pause followed. Then, "The crate." Elias let the silence stretch just long enough to be noticed. "And if I did?" The figure gave a small, almost thoughtful nod, as though confirming something already suspected. "Then you're further along than the others." A gust of wind passed between them, carrying with it the scent of salt and distant fuel. The rain shifted direction briefly, brushing against Elias's face before settling again. "The others," Elias repeated. "You mean the ones who disappeared?" The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, they turned slightly, looking out toward the water. "They didn't disappear," they said at last. Elias followed their gaze. The harbor stretched out into darkness, broken only by scattered lights and the slow movement of distant ships. "Then where are they?" Another pause. "Out of time." Elias's expression did not change, though something in his posture became more attentive. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one that fits." The figure turned back toward him. For a moment, a faint glow from a distant lamp caught the edge of their face, but not enough to reveal it fully, just a hint of features, indistinct and shifting with the rain. Elias studied them. "You called this in," he said, "didn't you?" A slight incline of the head. "I made sure you'd come." "Why me?" "Because you listen." The answer came without hesitation. Elias let out a quiet breath. "That's a rare quality these days, apparently." "It is." The figure stepped closer, just enough to narrow the space between them. "Tell me," they said, "what did you hear?" Elias considered the question. "The watches," he said. "All ticking, all different." "And what did that tell you?" "That someone wanted to send a message." The figure remained still. "And?" Elias's gaze sharpened slightly. "And that the message isn't finished yet." For the first time, something like approval seemed to settle in the air between them. A small shift, subtle but present. "Good," the figure said. Then, without warning, they reached into their coat and produced something small, metallic. They held it out. Elias did not take it immediately. "What is it?" "A key." Elias glanced down at it. It was old, brass, worn smooth along its edges, with a small engraving near the handle, something too faint to make out clearly in the dim light. Where does it go? The figure's hand remained extended, somewhere that hasn't been opened in a long time. Elias hesitated only briefly. Then he reached out and took the key. It felt colder than expected. He turned it slightly in his fingers, studying the engraving. "Warehouse B?" he asked. The figure shook their head. "No." "Then where?" The figure stepped back, the rain beginning to blur their outline once more. "You'll find it." "That's not much help." "It's enough." Elias looked up. But the space where the figure had stood was already empty. No footsteps, no sound of retreat, just the rain, steady and unchanged, falling across the docks. Elias remained there for a while, the key resting in his hand, the harbor stretching out before him. Then at last he slipped it into his coat pocket beside the watch. He turned back toward the warehouse, and somewhere, deep within its shadowed interior, one of the watches stopped ticking. Elias did not return to the warehouse immediately. Instead, he walked along the length of the pier, past rusted bollards and coiled ropes darkened by rain, letting the rhythm of his steps settle into something steady. The encounter lingered in his thoughts, not as a shock but as a quiet shift, like a piece on a board that had moved without warning. The key in his pocket felt heavier than it should have. He reached the end of the pier and paused, looking out over the water. A cargo ship moved slowly across the harbor, its lights dimmed by distance and weather. For a moment it seemed to glide without sound, a shape passing through layers of mist. Then the bell of a buoy rang again, low and irregular. Elias turned back. Warehouse B waited behind him, its open doors unchanged, its presence as unassuming as before. If not for the crate, the footprints, and the stranger, it might have been just another forgotten structure among many. He stepped inside once more. The air carried the same scent, salt, old wood, and something faintly metallic. The overhead lamp swayed gently, its movement unchanged, as though time within the building had not moved forward at all. The hat still rested where he had left it. Elias walked past it without stopping. He moved toward the narrow gap between the containers, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dimness. The corridor seemed narrower now, though perhaps that was only the effect of returning to it with a different understanding. He stepped through. The hum returned. Subtle, steady, like a distant engine or a current running beneath the floor. It was not loud enough to command attention, but once noticed it could not be ignored. Elias followed the passage to the small chamber. The crate was still there. The watches remained in place. Tick, tick, tick. But something had changed. He crouched again, his gaze moving across the arrangement. One space was empty. Where a watch had once been, there was now only a faint impression in the wood. Elias did not reach for the remaining watches this time. Instead, he stood slowly, scanning the room once more. "All right," he said, his voice low. "Now you're moving pieces." He turned toward the walls again, more carefully now, tracing the edges of the space with his light. The surfaces were uneven, worn by years of use, but there was something else, something less obvious. A line, faint, running along the seam where two metal panels met. Elias stepped closer. He ran his fingers along the line, feeling the slight difference in texture. It was subtle but deliberate, not damage, not decay. A join. He reached into his coat and pulled out the key. For a moment, he simply held it, considering. Then he lowered the flashlight slightly and examined the seam again. There. Near the center, almost invisible unless one knew to look, an indentation. Small, precise, key-shaped. Elias exhaled slowly. "Well," he murmured. He inserted the key. It fit without resistance. For a moment, Nothing happened. Then, with a soft internal shift, something clicked. The hum deepened. Not louder, just closer. Elias stepped back as the panel began to move. It did not swing open like a door. Instead, it slid inward, disappearing into the wall with a smoothness that suggested careful design rather than decay. Beyond it, a narrow stairwell descended into darkness. The air that rose from below carried a different scent. Not the harbor, not the warehouse. Something older, drier. Elias retrieved his flashlight and directed the beam downward. The steps were metal, worn but intact, spiraling gently out of sight. He paused at the threshold. Behind him, the watches continued their uneven rhythm. Before him, the stairwell waited. He chose the stairs. Each step echoed softly as he descended, the sound contained within the narrow space. The hum followed him, growing more distinct, though still difficult to place. After a few turns, the stairwell opened into a larger area. Elias stepped onto solid ground. The beam of his flashlight revealed a long corridor stretching ahead, its walls lined with pipes and old wiring, some of it still intact, some long since abandoned. The floor was dry, dust settled in thin layers, undisturbed by recent movement. Except there. Footprints, clear, fresh, leading forward. Elias followed. The corridor bent slightly, then widened, opening into a series of interconnected rooms. Not large, but not small either. Each one contained remnants of a different purpose. Tables, shelves, old equipment, all left behind in various states of disuse. In one room, a row of lockers stood against the wall, their doors partially open. Inside, coats hung untouched, their fabric stiff with age. In another, a long table held scattered papers, their edges curled and yellowed. Elias stepped closer to the table. He picked up one of the papers, careful not to tear it. Numbers, columns and rows, neatly written, though faded. Dates, perhaps, or times? He set it back down. The hum was stronger here, not mechanical, not entirely, more like a presence than a sound. He moved on. At the far end of the corridor, a single door stood closed. Unlike the others, it showed no signs of wear, no rust, no damage. It looked maintained. Elias stopped in front of it. The footprints ended here. He reached for the handle. It turned easily. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the room was different, not abandoned. Not forgotten, arranged. A desk stood in the center, its surface clear except for a single object. A watch. Elias stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The hum settled into a steady tone, almost level now, as though it had reached its source. He approached the desk. The watch lay flat, its face illuminated faintly by a light he could not immediately identify. It ticked, slowly, evenly. Unlike the others, Elias picked it up. The moment his fingers closed around it, the hum ceased. Completely. The silence that followed was not empty. It was held, as though the space itself were waiting. Elias looked down at the watch. The hands were moving, but not forward, backward. He watched them for a moment, the motion steady, deliberate. Then, without warning, a sound reached him. A footstep, behind him. Elias did not turn immediately. Instead, he listened. Another step. Closer, measured. He exhaled slowly, then he turned. And for the first time since entering the docks, he was not alone. The figure standing behind him did not move when Elias turned. It stood just inside the doorway, where the dim corridor met the steadier light of the room. Its outline was clear, though the face remained partly obscured by shadow, as if the light itself refused to settle there. Elias held the watch loosely in his hand. The ticking continued, backward, slow, even. "You've come further than the others," the figure said. The voice was different from the one on the pier. Not unfamiliar, but not the same. Elias tilted his head slightly, studying them. "That seems to be a common observation tonight." The figure stepped forward, closing the door behind them with a careful motion. The latch clicked into place, quiet but certain. "No one else made it past the stairs," they said. Elias's gaze shifted briefly to the door, then back. "And you did?" "I've been here longer than you." The answer was delivered without weight, as though it was simply a fact, nothing more. Elias glanced at the watch again. "Out of time?" he asked. A faint pause. "Yes." Elias considered that, turning the watch once in his fingers. The hands continued their steady retreat, each second moving away from something unseen. "Then help me understand it," he said. The figure approached the desk, stopping a short distance away. In the steadier light, more details emerged. Clothing worn but intact, edges softened by use, not neglect. Their posture was composed, though there was a stillness to it that felt deliberate, not rigid, but held. "You've seen the crate," they said. "The watches?" Elias nodded. "All set to different times." "Moments," the figure corrected gently. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Moments?" The figure inclined their head slightly. "Each one marks a point where something shifted. A decision, a step. A second that didn't quite follow the path it was meant to." Elias let that settle. "And the people who disappeared, they followed those moments." Elias's expression remained unchanged, though his attention sharpened. "That still doesn't explain where they went." The figure looked at the watch in his hand. "They're not gone," they said. "They're displaced." Elias glanced down at the watch again. "Into what?" The figure took a breath, though it seemed more like a habit than a necessity. "Into the spaces between." The words hung in the air, neither dramatic nor vague, just stated. Elias gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the structure of the answer, if not its meaning. "All right," he said. "Let's say I accept that." The figure watched him. "What happens next?" Elias turned slightly, pacing once across the room, his boots making a faint sound against the floor. "Someone sets up a crate of watches," he said, "each one tied to a moment. People start disappearing. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, just absence." He stopped, glancing back. "And you're telling me they've stepped into something that exists outside the usual order of things?" The figure did not interrupt. Elias continued. "So either someone is guiding them there, or something is drawing them in." The figure's gaze shifted, just slightly. "A door," they said. Elias's eyes narrowed a fraction. "That's what this is." The figure nodded. "Or several doors," they added. Elias looked toward the walls of the room. They appeared solid, unbroken. But now, he wasn't so certain. "And the key?" he asked. "You've already used one." Elias glanced at the seam where the panel had opened above. "That got me here." "Yes." "And this?" He lifted the watch slightly. The figure considered it. "That one doesn't open anything." Elias frowned slightly. "Then what does it do?" The figure stepped closer, stopping just within arm's reach. "It anchors you." Elias looked at them, then back at the watch. "To what? To your own time?" The words settled in a way that felt precise. Not metaphor. Not entirely. Elias exhaled quietly. "And if I didn't have it?" The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, they turned, walking slowly toward the far wall of the room. "Come," they said. Elias followed. The wall looked no different than the others, plain, uninterrupted. But as the figure approached, they raised a hand and rested it lightly against the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the wall shifted. Not visibly at first, more like a change in depth, as though the surface had drawn back by a fraction of an inch. A line appeared, faint, then another. Elias stepped closer. The lines formed a shape, an outline of a doorway that had not been there before. The figure pressed their hand forward. The surface gave way, not opening, but yielding. Beyond it there was no room, no corridor, only a dim, undefined space where the light seemed to lose its direction. Elias felt the watch in his hand grow colder. The ticking steadied, still backward. He leaned slightly, peering into the opening. Shapes moved within, not clearly, not with intention, just shifting, as though the space itself were in motion. "What is that?" he asked. The figure lowered their hand, though the opening remained. "A place where moments overlap," they said. "Where choices don't settle." Elias watched the movement within. "And the people? They step in," the figure said, "and sometimes they don't step back out." Elias straightened. "And you?" The figure's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "I stayed too long." Elias looked at them again. There was no fear in their expression, no urgency, just a quiet awareness. "And now?" The figure glanced at the watch in his hand. "Now you decide how far you go." Elias considered that. Then he looked back at the opening. The shapes continued their slow, uncertain movement. The air around it felt different, not colder, not warmer, just less defined. He took a step closer. The ticking of the watch seemed louder now, though it hadn't changed. He paused at the threshold. Behind him, the room remained steady, grounded. Before him, something else entirely. Elias lifted the watch slightly, watching the hands move, backward, steady. Then he slipped it into his pocket. He rolled his shoulders once as though settling into a familiar rhythm, and without another word, he stepped through the doorway. The moment Elias crossed the threshold, the sense of direction shifted. Not abruptly, not in a way that could be pointed to, but gradually, like stepping into a room where the air carried a different weight. The light from behind him dimmed, though it did not vanish. It simply withdrew, leaving him within a space that held no clear source of illumination. He paused, allowing his eyes to adjust. The ground beneath his feet felt solid, though when he looked down it did not resemble any surface he recognized. It was not wood, not stone, not metal. It seemed to hold the idea of a floor rather than its substance. He reached into his coat and touched the watch. The ticking remained steady, backward. That, at least, had not changed. Elias took another step forward. The space around him began to take on faint structure, as though responding to his movement. Shapes formed at the edges of perception, lines suggesting walls, corners that almost aligned, corridors that hinted at direction before softening again. He chose a path that seemed stable. As he walked, the sound of his footsteps returned, though it carried no echo. It existed only in the moment it was made, then faded completely. After a short distance, something appeared ahead. A doorway. Not like the one he had passed through. This one was older in its design, framed by worn wood and a handle polished smooth by use. A faint light spilled from beneath it, warm and steady. Elias approached, his pace unhurried. He reached for the handle. It turned easily. Inside, the space resolved fully. A room, small, enclosed, familiar in its construction, wooden beams overhead, a single lantern resting on a table, its flame steady despite the absence of any visible air movement. At the far side of the room, a man sat on a crate. His posture was relaxed, though his gaze was fixed on the floor in front of him, as if waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Elias stepped inside. The door closed behind him without sound. The man did not look up immediately. Instead, he spoke. Didn't think anyone else would find this place. His voice was quiet, though not uncertain. Elias remained near the doorway. You've been here a while. The man let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh. Depends how you measure it. Elias glanced at the lantern. Its light did not flicker. And how do you measure it? The man finally lifted his gaze. His eyes adjusted slowly, focusing on Elias as though the act required effort. I tried counting at first, he said. Seconds, minutes, whatever made sense. He shook his head slightly. Didn't work. Elias stepped closer, his attention steady. Harris Cole, he said. The man gave a small nod. That's me. Elias studied him. There were no visible injuries, no signs of struggle, just a certain stillness in his posture, as though movement had become less necessary over time. You disappeared from the docks. Harris considered that. Maybe, he said, or maybe I just stepped sideways. Elias did not respond to that immediately. Instead, he moved toward the table, his fingers brushing lightly against its surface. You walked into this place. Harris nodded again. Found something like a door, he said. Didn't look like much at first, just different. He glanced around the room. Then I was here. Elias looked toward the walls. They held their shape, steady, defined. Can you leave? Harris's expression shifted slightly. I've tried. Elias waited. The door's still there, Harris continued, but it doesn't always go back to the same place. Elias's gaze sharpened. What do you mean? Harris gestured toward the doorway behind Elias. Sometimes it opens to the docks. Sometimes it opens somewhere else entirely. Elias turned slightly, looking at the door. It remained closed, unremarkable. And sometimes, he asked. Harris lowered his gaze again. Sometimes it doesn't open at all. The lantern's light cast steady shadows across the room, outlining the edges of objects with quiet precision. Elias reached into his coat and removed the watch. The ticking continued, backward. Harris's eyes lifted, drawn to the sound. You've got one too, he said. Elias glanced at him. You've seen these before. Harris nodded. There was one here when I arrived. Elias looked around the room. And now? Harris gestured toward the table. Elias followed the motion. There, near the lantern, a faint circular mark remained on the wood. Empty. It stopped, Harris said. Elias stepped closer, placing his watch beside the mark. The ticking filled the space between them. Harris leaned forward slightly. That one's still moving. Elias watched the hands, backward, steady. What happened when yours stopped? He asked. Harris was quiet for a moment. Then, the room changed. Elias glanced up. How? Harris searched for the words. Not all at once, he said. Just pieces of it. The door moved. The walls shifted. Things didn't line up the same way anymore. Elias considered that. And you stayed. Harris gave a small shrug. Didn't seem like I had much choice. Elias picked up the watch again, slipping it back into his coat. The ticking softened slightly. He turned toward the door. Then we won't wait for it to change. Harris watched him. You're leaving. Elias placed his hand on the handle. I'm trying. Harris stood slowly, his movements careful, as though reacquainting himself with motion. For what it's worth, he said. I hope that works out better for you than it did for me. Elias glanced back at him. Come with me. Harris hesitated, then he nodded. Elias turned the handle. The door opened. Beyond it, the space was not the docks, not the corridor, something else. A long hallway, lined with doors on either side, each one slightly different from the next. Some were open, revealing fragments of rooms within. Others remained closed, their surfaces worn in ways that suggested long use. Elias stepped forward. Harris followed. The door behind them closed quietly. They stood in the hallway for a moment, taking in the arrangement. Have you seen this before? Elias asked. Harris shook his head. No. Elias nodded once. Then we're still moving. He began walking. The hallway stretched ahead, its length uncertain, its end not immediately visible. The doors on either side seemed to shift slightly as they passed, their positions adjusting just enough to keep the path from becoming predictable. Harris kept pace beside him. Where do you think this leads? He asked. Elias glanced at the doors as they moved. Back, he said. Harris frowned slightly. Back where? Elias's expression remained steady. To wherever this started. They continued down the hallway, the faint sound of the watch ticking in Elias's pocket marking their passage. Backward, step by step, toward something that had not yet fully revealed itself. They walked for some time, not long enough to grow tired, not short enough to ignore the distance. The hallway held its shape as they moved, though the doors along its sides seemed to drift in small, uncertain ways, never enough to disorient, only enough to remind them that this place did not follow a fixed pattern. Elias kept a steady pace. Harris walked half a step behind, his attention shifting from one door to the next. Some stood slightly open, revealing brief impressions of rooms beyond. A table set with untouched dishes, a chair by a window where rain fell in a place that might not exist, a narrow stairwell spiraling upward into dim light. Other doors remained closed, their surfaces marked by faint scratches or worn handles. At one point, Harris slowed. There, he said quietly. Elias stopped. A door to their right stood open just enough to reveal the edge of a familiar shape, a wooden crate, the same size and form as the one in the warehouse above. Elias turned his head, studying it. Same as before, Harris murmured. Elias nodded. But not the same place. He stepped closer, careful not to cross the threshold. Inside, the crate sat alone in a room that mirrored the one beneath the docks, though slightly altered. The walls were closer. The air seemed stiller. And inside the crate, watches. Fewer than before. Tick, tick, tick. Elias reached into his coat, touching the watch in his pocket. It answered with its steady, backward rhythm. Harris leaned in slightly. Think they all end up here? He asked. Elias considered the question. Or they start here, he said. Harris glanced at him. That's not much clearer. No, Elias agreed. He stepped back from the doorway. We keep moving. They continued down the hallway. The further they went, the quieter the space became, not empty but less defined. The faint impressions behind the doors grew softer, harder to place. At last, they reached something different. The hallway ended, not with a wall, but with an open space that spread outward in all directions. Elias slowed. Harris stopped beside him. Before them lay a wide expanse, its surface faintly reflective, like still water under dim light. There were no walls here, no clear boundaries, only a horizon that seemed to fold into itself the longer one looked, and scattered across this expanse. Figures, not many, a handful, standing, walking, pausing, each one moving at a slightly different pace, as though guided by a rhythm only they could hear. Harris exhaled slowly. "Those are people." Elias nodded. The watch in his pocket ticked once, then again, backward. He stepped forward. The surface beneath his feet held firm, though it reflected a faint, distorted version of the space above. As they moved closer, the figures became clearer. A woman standing with her hands at her sides, looking towards something just out of view. A man walking in a slow circle, his steps precise, repeated. Another figure seated on the ground, head tilted slightly upward. None of them reacted to Elias or Harris. Not at first. Harris lowered his voice. "Do they see us?" Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he approached one of the figures, the man walking in the circle. The man's movements were steady. Step, turn, step, turn. Elias watched for a moment. Then he spoke. "Excuse me." The man paused. Slowly he turned his head. His eyes settled on Elias. For a brief moment, recognition flickered. Then it faded. "Have you been here long?" Elias asked. The man blinked, as though the question had arrived from a distance. He began. Then he stopped. His gaze shifted slightly, searching. "I was going somewhere," he said. Elias nodded. "And then?" The man looked around, his expression uncertain. "I think I'm still going." Elias glanced at Harris. Harris's face had tightened slightly, though he said nothing. The man resumed his walking. Step, turn. Step, turn. Elias stepped back. "They're caught," Harris said quietly. Elias nodded. "In their moments." The words from earlier returned, settling into place. Harris looked out across the expanse. "Can we get them out?" Elias reached into his coat, pulling out the watch. The ticking filled the space between them. Backward, steady. He looked at the figures again, then at the horizon, then back at the watch. "Maybe," he said. He walked toward the woman standing alone. She did not move as he approached. Her gaze remained fixed ahead. Elias stepped beside her, following her line of sight. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, a doorway. Far in the distance, not fully formed, just an outline. Elias raised the watch slightly. The ticking seemed to shift, not in speed, but in presence. The outline of the doorway sharpened. Harris stepped closer. "You see that?" he asked. Elias nodded. "That's where she was going." Harris looked at the woman. "And now?" Elias considered the distance. "Now it's still there." He took a step forward. The doorway grew clearer. Another step, sharper. The woman shifted, just slightly. Her head turned. Her gaze moved from the empty space ahead to the forming doorway. Harris exhaled. "It's working." Elias didn't respond. He kept moving. Each step brought the doorway into clearer focus, its edges solidifying, its presence becoming more certain. Behind them, the man in the circle slowed. His steps faltered. He looked up, toward the same point. The figures across the expanse began to shift. Small movements, subtle changes, not all at once, but enough. Elias stopped. The doorway now stood clearly before them, wooden, familiar, the same shape as the one Harris had first entered. He turned slightly, glancing at the others. Some had begun to move. Others remained still, their attention caught between what was and what had been. Harris stepped up beside him. "So that's it?" he asked. "We just show them the way back?" Elias looked at the watch. The hands continued their backward motion, steady. "No," he said. Harris frowned slightly. "Then what?" Elias met his gaze. "We give them the moment to choose it again." Harris was quiet. Then he nodded. Elias turned back to the doorway. He placed his hand on the handle. The ticking grew more pronounced. Then, for the first time, it paused, just for a second. Elias opened the door, and beyond it, the docks of Gotham waited, rain falling, lights distant, real. Elias stepped aside. The woman moved first, slowly. Then, with more certainty, she passed through the doorway. Gone. Harris let out a breath. One by one, the others began to follow. Not rushed, not forced, just moving. Elias remained where he stood, holding the door open. The watch in his hand resumed its motion, backward, until at last, only he and Harris remained. Harris looked at him. "You coming?" he asked. Elias glanced once more across the expanse. It was quieter now, less crowded, but not empty. It would never be empty. He nodded. "Yeah." They stepped through together. And as the door closed behind them, the ticking changed. The rain met them first, a steady fall, tracing its path across the docks as though nothing had shifted, as though the night had remained unchanged. The air carried the familiar scent of salt and wood, of distant engines and quiet water. Elias stepped forward onto the pier. The ground beneath his feet felt certain again. Harris followed, slower at first, his gaze moving across the harbor as if reacquainting himself with something long set aside. "They're back," Harris said quietly. Elias glanced over his shoulder. Behind them, the space where the doorway had been now held only the wall of the warehouse. No seam, no trace, only aged metal, worn and still. "For now," Elias replied. Harris nodded, accepting that without question. They stood there for a while, listening to the rhythm of the rain. Somewhere out in the harbor, a buoy bell rang again, steady in its uneven pattern. Harris drew a breath deeper this time. "I think I remember how long I've been gone," he said. Elias looked at him. "How long?" Harris gave a faint, uncertain smile. "Long enough that it doesn't matter much." Elias considered that. "Then what does?" Harris looked out over the water. "Being here," he said. "That's enough." Elias gave a small nod. "That's a good place to start." A faint movement caught his attention. Further down the dock, near the edge of the light, a figure stood, still, watching. Elias didn't need to look closely to recognize the posture, the same presence as before, the one who had handed him the key. Harris followed his gaze. "Friend of yours?" he asked. Elias exhaled lightly. "Something like that." The figure did not approach, did not speak. They simply stood there as though observing the outcome of something that had already been set in motion. Elias reached into his coat and removed the watch. For the first time since he had picked it up, the hands were still. No longer moving backward, no longer marking anything at all. Harris glanced at it. "Guess it did its job." Elias turned the watch slightly, the face catching a faint reflection of the dock lights. "Maybe." He slipped it back into his pocket. The figure at the far end of the pier shifted, just enough to suggest departure. Elias took a step forward, but when he reached the place where the figure had been, there was no one there, only the rain, falling steadily. Harris joined him. "They do that a lot?" he asked. Elias looked out over the harbor again. "Sometimes." Harris gave a small laugh. "I'll get used to it." Elias allowed himself the hint of a smile. "Maybe," They began walking back along the pier, their steps unhurried. The warehouse behind them stood quiet now, its doors open just enough to let the dim light spill out onto the dock. Inside, the rows of crates remained unchanged, their contents unknown and, for the moment, undisturbed. As they passed, Elias paused briefly. He glanced toward the narrow gap between the containers. Nothing there, no passage, no hum, just a shadow where something had once been. He nodded once, as though acknowledging it. Then he continued on. At the edge of the docks, the city began to rise again. Streets lined with flickering lights, buildings reaching upward into the low clouds, their windows glowing faintly through the rain. Harris slowed. "I think I'll head this way," he said, gesturing toward a narrow street leading away from the harbor. Elias stopped. "You'll be all right?" Harris considered that. "Yeah," he said. "I think I will." Elias studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. "Good." Harris offered a small, grateful look. "Thanks for coming back for us." Elias shook his head slightly. "I didn't come back," he said. "I just kept going." Harris smiled at that. "Guess that works too." He turned and began walking, his figure gradually blending into the rhythm of the city, until he was no longer distinct from it. Elias remained where he was. For a while he simply stood, watching the rain settle into its steady pattern, listening to the distant sounds of Gotham as they wove together into something familiar. A passing car, a far-off voice, the quiet movement of water against wood. He reached into his coat once more, feeling the shape of the watch resting there. It no longer ticked, but it was not empty. It held something quieter than sound, a measure that did not need marking. Elias let his hand rest there for a moment. Then he lowered it. The night stretched on, unhurried. The docks returned to their usual rhythm, as though nothing had ever disturbed them. Ships would come and go. Crates would be moved. Names would be spoken and forgotten. And somewhere beyond the edges of what could be easily seen, other doors would wait. Not hidden, not lost. Simply present. Elias turned and began to walk, back toward the city, back toward the streets that would offer new questions, new traces to follow, new stories that had not yet taken shape. The rain followed him, steady and unchanged, marking no time at all. And the docks behind him settled once more into the quiet persistence of Gotham, holding their secrets as they always had, until the next moment chose to reveal itself.